Okay, good evening, gentlemen. The Rebbe Rashab, in our discourse, is building us the full picture of the nature of our reality, in the sense that our reality is bottled, our reality is nullified to godliness. And this argument takes quite a number of steps. First, our discourse was not speaking about our reality. First, our discourse, in almost an unrelated topic in a sense, was explaining the unity of God from a different perspective, from the idea of God's self-revelation and God's self-concealment, and how these two things are really one, how these two things are equally godly, and when God conceals himself, when God hides, it's only himself that he hides behind. So the truth is that even when God is concealed, so to speak, that is still equally as godly, that is still 100% as godly as God revealing himself. Similarly, good evening. Similarly, we were explaining how if there's no change in God revealing himself or concealing himself, God how he expresses, so to speak, then certainly there's no change in his concealment vis-a-vis the actual creator, the actual infinite one, right? In other words, from God's perspective, nothing ever really changes, because even though he is speaking two different realities, which is a different way of saying he's revealing and concealing himself in different ways to create and to emanate and to enter into relationships with other realities outside himself. All of these changes, all of these self-concealments, from God's perspective, it's all just an equal extension of godliness. God was 100% filling the place of the void. He was 100% the only thing manifesting itself and filling the entire reality before the universe was created. And now, even though there's an incredible amount of concealment of godliness to make room from the universe and to give everything that exists its nature, nevertheless, from his perspective, this is all, as we would say in Yiddish, Weitergettlichkeit. It's furthermore godliness. None of this is an actually different than God or outside of God, God forbid, because when God conceals himself, it's himself that he conceals himself with. Then we said that's all well and good, so you can say that nothing changes vis-a-vis the presence of God everywhere. Perhaps nothing really changes in the act of creation. But what about the creation itself? In other words, what about the things that are other than God? God, not an expression of God, but something that's actually separate from God, namely the creation, that our reality has two parties looking out at it at least. There's God, and then there's the creation, there's what God has made. And the answer is that what God has made is actually very questionable. It's very questionable the extent to which it exists. And we began to question it very powerfully. And the conclusion is going to be that really there is nothing that attains separateness from godliness. There is nothing that manages to actually break away and become an independent reality from God. On the contrary, all that's really here, despite what appears to our fleshly eyes, all that's really here is an expression of godliness. And we began to explain this in order. The first thing to understand is that this reality depends on God at every moment, because it's created something from nothing. And we explained at great length and in great detail how this is very different than how something depends on something else in our regular human understanding. In our regular human understanding, in other words, within our reality, for something to depend on something else means it's caused by that thing, which is a different way of saying it's explained by that thing. When God creates something from nothing, he does it in a way where the effect is the effect, but the effect has no cause. The effect did not exist in potential in any way in the thing that caused it. It's created as a totally, so to speak, by divine fiat. God creates it because he wants to, with no process and with no logical explanation for where it comes from. This is what we mean by something from nothing. And when God creates in this way, the thing that results depends on God, like the flight of the rock depends on the hand that throws the rock. The power that was in the hand that was imparted to the rock to make it fly upwards, which is a different way of saying that really all that's here is an external imposition. Just as rocks can't fly, the nothing that preceded the universe cannot become something. The rock is flying upward, and the nothing has become something. So what you're looking at is not a flying rock, which is not a thing that exists. What you're looking at is a rock that has been compelled to fly by an external force. Someone has come along and forced this rock up into the air. Similarly, the nothing that preceded the universe's existence, the nothingness that was here before, that contained no potential for creation to exist, was compelled into being something, into existing by God. But there's no such thing as nothing being something, just like there's no such thing as a flying rock. All you're seeing is an external imposition. And when you understand clearly that this is what we mean by creating something from nothing, you arrive at the inevitable conclusion that the result depends constantly on the cause. The effect depends constantly on the cause. Like the flight of the rock depends constantly on the energy that the hand imparts to it, right? Not in a way that it depends on it because it's its source. We mean that it depends on it because it's totally unnatural. It's a total external imposition. And therefore, if that imposition were to cease, this thing would totally cease to be. If the energy that you've put into the rock to make it fly upwards runs out, the rock falls back to the earth. And in fact, the rock was always a regular rock. The rock never became a flying rock. There are no flying rocks. There are only rocks that are made to fly. And since there are no flying rocks, only rocks that are made to fly, the second you stop making it fly, it totally ceases to fly. That existence ceases to be. Similarly, there is no nothing that becomes something, which is a total logical contradiction. There is only nothing that is made to be something. And if that thing that we're making it be something were to be removed, it would totally cease to exist, right? Not because not in a way where it would, of course, disintegrate or fall apart, right? Or lose some aspect of itself. It would totally cease to exist, the way the flight of the rock ceases to exist, right? Which really, what are we saying? And that's what we spoke about last time. Last time we spoke about that. What that really means is that this thing never really existed in the first place as an independent thing. We said this means that the world, now that God is creating it, now that the rock is flying upward, now that God is making this nothing be a something, what is the something that results? The something that results is batul b'metzias, right? The nullification of its very being, of its accessible being, as we explained last week, the nullification of it being accessible as a separate thing. In other words, there is nothing here but an extension and an expression of the godliness that makes the nothing into something. Just like when the rock flies upward, there is no flying rock. There's just the flight of the rock that has been made to be by the hand that throws it. So too, our universe is not really here. It's an external imposition that we are interpreting as a flying rock. We are seeing the rock, our ene basar, our fleshly eyes, see the world. This is how God has made the situation. And we interpret what is the constant external imposition of God as an actual separate being. We don't see the rock being made to fly. We emphatically see the flying rock. God doesn't let us see the rock that's been made to fly. He conceals that from us in the way we are created. Our fleshly eyes see only the flying rock. We see only something that has been made to be with true permanence, as if it truly exists, separate from the force that's making it be. Now, last week we read much further than we really explained, because we're saving that for this week. So we are now going to reread what we read last week, and we're going to explain it, God willing, this week. It's very timely what we're learning, because we learned all of this in Chitas. These past few days, this is exactly what we've been learning in Sha'ar Yichud V'Emunah, the Gate of Unity and Faith, chapter 3, and preceded by chapter 2, which is what we learned in previous weeks. And now we're learning what it says in chapter 3, although interestingly, some of what we've learned in this mimer is later in Sha'ar Yichud V'Emunah. This mimer is in a different order than the Tanya. We learned it in a different way with a different framing, so we've actually not gone in exactly the same order that the Tanya goes in when it discusses these concepts, but it is all the concepts, and we've explained them in a different way, and hopefully our second time learning these concepts, and also the teacher's further experience having tried to teach and explain it and learning it another time himself hopefully means that we're getting better as we go, with a better understanding. That would be ideal. That would be great. Otherwise, we can always say that we learned it one more time so that the next time wasn't this time, right? We can always fall back on that. L'chaim.
L'chaim.
The Rebbe Rashab goes a step deeper, and it's the same step that the Alter Rebbe does. I'll say it again. This is the same flow that you'll find in the Tanya. The Alter Rebbe has the same steps. It's in different words and it's explained a little bit differently, but it's the same basic reasoning. At least the first 3 chapters of Sha'ar Yichud V'Emunah are basically more or less in order in our discourse. The first 3 chapters of the second part of Tanya. So the Rebbe Rashab goes deeper. He prefaces this going deeper, Be'emes yesh le'emar habitul be'omek yeser. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down on Mem Aleph, the beginning of the line. 5 lines down from the top on Mem Aleph, the beginning of the line, he says, Be'emes yesh le'emar habitul be'omek yeser. In truth, we can propose, yesh le'emar in a mimer usually means, this is an original thought from that Rebbe. So I personally, because I don't understand this properly, am not certain what the chidush is, what's the innovation. Normally when you learn a discourse and the Rebbe says yesh le'emar means like we can propose. In other words, I've now said things that I received, so I know they're true. And now yesh le'emar, I'm going to add. I'm going to add to what's been said on my own account. Is what a Rebbe says in a mimer. Yesh le'emar, we can propose. And of course the Rebbe's yesh le'emar is to the Chassid, Vados Gemura. Right, the Rebbe's we can propose, perhaps, right, we go even further when the Rebbe says in the Kutei Sichos, Yesh Loimar B'derech Efshar, right, or Ulai Yesh Loimar. We could say maybe it's like this, we could say it's possibly like this. By Chassidim, that means that's how it is.
That's dach.
That's exactly how it is. The Rebbe's it might be is my for sure it is. I have no problem with that. It's the old joke of the Mittler Rebbe's Badchan, the Mittler Rebbe's court jester, who said that me and the Rebbe are exactly the same. And before they had a chance to kill him, he explained to them, no, we're exactly the same. Everything that I know, the Rebbe knows. And everything the Rebbe doesn't know, I also don't know. We're exactly the same, right? It's the same idea. So, the Rebbe Rashab says, but the key here is, Habitul be'emek yoser. We're going to explain the nullification of the world at a deeper level. Right? Now, you could ask, normally we don't really seem to go much deeper than batal b'metzias. Batal b'metzias is pretty batal. When you say something is nullified, b'metzias, right, it means, as we explained last week, that this thing does not exist as its own thing. This thing is only the expression of something else, right? That's what bittul b'metzias means, right? We explained the lower level of bittul last week, which is bittul hayesh, where bittul hayesh is the nullification of independence, right? Where something is nullified, it becomes defined by something else, right? In the Avedic Maimarim, the Maimarim that are about how to serve God, b'derech klal, in a very general way, you would say the bittul of the nefesh habahamis in davening, like the bittul of Psukei de Zimra is the bittul of bittul hayesh, right? We had an Avodah Maimer going through davening before we started learning this, if you'll recall, right? We did all the steps of davening. So the Avodah of Psukei de Zimra, where you're trying to bring the Nefesh HaBahamis, which is an independent being and perceives itself to be independent of God, and you're trying to get it on the bandwagon and trying to get it to appreciate godliness, that's all Bittul HaYesh, right? You're taking a thing which is fundamentally independent, and you're explaining, you're not so independent. You too are defined by godliness, caused by godliness, appreciate godliness, have a place for godliness, right? You take something which seems to be not part of the puzzle, and you take it and you make it part of the puzzle. You weave it into this godly picture. And then when you move on to Birchas Kriyas Shema, that's when you really mevatel the Nefesh HaBahamis, because Birchas Kriyas Shema is where you talk about the angels and you tell the animal soul that this is your true source. In other words, if you were greater, if you were exactly what you are, but greater, you would be one of the angels that was praising God, right? Which is an even higher form of bittul. But all of this is ultimately bittul hayesh, right? You're taking an independent thing and you're returning it to a state of dependence. You're returning it to a state, or if dependence is a weird word, and it is a weird word, if the connotations of the word are weird, you're defining the thing in terms of godliness. You're returning it to its true godly definition and self, right? Bittul b'metzias is to do away with the thing. You don't start with the idea that the thing exists. You start with the idea that God exists, right? There's this thing that's apart from God. That's just a further expression of God. That's bittul b'metzias, right? Very generally, we say about the nefesh elokis. The nefesh elokis is able to appreciate bittul b'metzias because the core of the godly soul is not to be separate, but to not be, as explained in Tanya, chapter 18, 19, somewhere over there, we explain that the nefesh elokis' deepest nature is to not be. All it wants is to return to its source and or Ein Sof and become nothing. Right? So the godly soul can appreciate and can connect to bittul b'metzias. It's nothing but a manifestation of godliness. There's nothing here. All that's here is godliness, which, as you'll see in our mimer, that's what we've been discussing. We've been discussing how really, although the godly soul may be the only thing in the world that knows it, everything in the world in its true nature is bittul b'metzias. Right? We can't see it. In a basar lanu, we have fleshly eyes, right? We have fleshly eyes and we look through our eyes with an animal soul, right? So obviously it's very hard for us to relate to this idea, but we can at least intellectually know and appreciate the truth of the reality, which is that it's bittul b'metzias. All that's here is godliness manifesting itself. There really is no creation. There's just godliness manifesting itself. Just like there's no such thing as a flying rock. There's only a hand making a rock fly, right? There is no creation. There is no such thing as a creation, something from nothing. There's only godliness making a thing, imposing on a thing to make it exist. So now we're saying we're going to explain the bittul in a deeper level. We're going to say how it's nullified at an even deeper level than that. And of course the question is, what's deeper than that? We've already said the thing doesn't exist. Really, there's only godliness manifesting as this thing. We've already admitted there's no such thing as a flying rock. Right? So what's the next level? What's the next level? The next level is like this. We're saying there is nothing here in the place of the creation but godliness. The creation is bittul b'metzias. There's godliness. That this table is not really a table. I think this is a table because ene basar lanu. I have fleshly eyes. If God gave me permission to see the reality, I would see that there's only the divine speech compelling this at every moment to exist. And there is no aspect of this thing which is not that divine speech. That divine speech is all that's here. There's nothing else here, right? However, there is still one sense in which you can say that the table is here. And the sense is that the table seems to be, or perhaps is, you could say, a manifestation of the divine power that is creating it, right? We've already said the table is nothing but godliness, right? But you could say it's that godly power which is manifesting or expressing itself as a table. A different way of putting it is that yes, all that is here is there's no table here. There's only godliness in the form of the table. But godliness in the form of the table, nevertheless, is not the same as godliness that is not in the form of a table, right? Godliness in the form of the table is still different than godliness preceding, before it comes down, so to speak, to manifest itself as a table, so to speak. So answers the Rebbe like this. The Rebbe is going to explain a deeper level of bittul. The godliness does not manifest as anything. This is really the peak of the riddle, the peak of the mystery. The peak of the mystery is that the godliness, like just in our metaphor of the throwing of the rock, it's the power of the arm, right? In the metaphor of the throwing of the rock, the power of the arm is still imparted to something to make it fly, right? You have the power that's in the arm, which is one step of this process, even if you say somehow it all takes place in the same moment in time, right? You still have the power in the arm, which is as it is in its original source, in its original cause. And then you have how it manifests to make the rock fly, right? So what you're saying is that everyone's in agreement. There's no such thing as a flying rock. There's only a rock that's made to fly. But a rock that's made to fly is different than the capacity in the arm to make the rock fly. There's two different things. There's cause and effect, potential, actual. When we have the capacity, we have the energy to make the rock fly. And then we actually impart that to the rock. And the rock is not the same thing as the arm, right? This metaphor is not accurately describing creation something from nothing. And not just because nothing in our reality can accurately describe creation something from nothing. That's also true. But there's another reason why it's not accurately describing it. Because, and this is the key, when God is making this thing that is separate from him exist, when he's making this table exist at every moment, something from nothing, in the way when he's making that rock to fly, right, that is taking place within the source of that power itself. It's not taking place anywhere other than within the source of that divine capacity. It's like the throwing of the rock was really not the throwing of the rock, but the arm throwing itself almost. Which is why the metaphor doesn't make any sense, right? That's why we're going to switch metaphors. Because in that metaphor, this doesn't really fit. We are describing an act of divine expression that is not expressed outward or to anywhere, right? It's self-contained and expressed within itself. Now, this is a bit of an edel concept, so I hope this is a refined and abstract concept. So I hope as we go forward, we'll be able to explain this a little better. Okay, I want to continue reading. In truth, we can propose and explain the bittul in a deeper way. We explained previously the etzem ein sof baruch hu nimtza lamata kamei lamayla mamish. God's infinitude is found below like it is found above literally. And this is what's one of the most beautiful parts of this mimer, because as I said last week when we were going through this very quickly, we are combining everything that we know already. We learned earlier in this mimer, in the first part, the seemingly unrelated part, where we're talking about the divine self-revelation and self-concealment, right? That our Ein Sof is the Ein Sof is everywhere. The infinite presence of God is everywhere, right? That's what was our first definition of Ani Havai Lo Shanisi, I God have not changed. The first definition of God not changing is that no matter how he manifests, no matter who he's communicating to, or how he's concealing himself, or which words he's saying was the metaphor we used a lot when we were learning that, right? No matter whether he's saying Yehi Or or Yehi Rakia, right? No matter how he's manifesting himself, no manifestation is any contradiction to the infinite presence of God. From God's perspective, and even from the perspective of the manifestation itself, right? All that's here is godliness. There's nothing here other than Ein Sof, right? The only question is, you remember our metaphor with the slider? What percentage is concealment, and how is the concealment present? And how is the revelation present? But concealment and revelation, the divine self-concealment, the divine self-expression, are all equally godly. So no matter how, if it's 100% concealment and God appears not to be in this place at all, that also is 100% godliness, right? The 100% godliness never changes. The only thing that changes is to what extent is it revealed or concealed, which are the two modes of expression of the infinite God, of the Ein Sof, of the infinite one, right? And if you think about it, I don't know if we spoke about this in earlier classes, so I'll just make a little point here. If you think about it, that's what it really means to be truly infinite, right? It means that even your negation, theoretically, even the thing that is the opposite of you, that says, I am not you, even that is you. Right? That's true infinitude, right? There cannot be, by definition, anything that is not godly, that is not the Ein Sof. Not because of some technicality that he happens to be everywhere, right? That wasn't the point. The point is, by dint of what he is, because he is the Ein Sof, because he is the truly infinite one, by the very nature of that, right? He is absolutely everywhere, always, and to even say that he could possibly be removed is to not grasp what it means that he's the Ein Sof, right? This is what we learned about in Tanya, in Shar Yichud Ve'emunah, in chapter 7, which was like there were 16 classes on chapter 7, the longest one in Shar Yichud Ve'emunah, something like that. And there we were talking about the Tzimtzum Lo Kapshutei, right? That when the Arizal says that God contracts himself, right? And some people understand that to mean God literally removes himself from the place of the universe. Alter Rebbe says they've simply misunderstood the concept. What it means when it says God contracts himself is that in the place that's left over, he's totally concealed, right? All the revelation was removed. But you can't say that the Ein Sof, the truly infinite one, was removed. It's almost like ascribing a body to him. You remember this argument? It's almost ascribing a bodily trait to God. God is not found somewhere the way this cup is found in this room. This cup is found in this room because the walls of this room make its border, make its gvul, and the cup is found within the space of the walls, and so the cup is in this room. The Ein Sof is also in this room. Not because of any relationship it has to the walls of the room, but because it is Ein Sof. It's the thing that is everywhere by definition, right? It's not here relative to the walls that define this room. It's here because nowhere cannot be our Ein Sof by definition. This should ring a bell from when we learned Shar Yichud Ve'emunah. The infinite presence of Hashem is everywhere. All that changes is whether it's revealed or concealed. But both of those two options are equally Ein Sof. There's no difference between these two. In terms of how much Ein Sof they are, there's no difference between these two things.
But saying that is also limiting God.
Why?
Because if we say God cannot remove himself from somewhere, it's limiting.
I didn't say anything about what God can or can't do, actually. I'm just explaining the nature of the Ein Sof.
Okay.
To say something has a nature is limiting. But suffice it to say, this is what God has chosen. Don't start with this now.
Sorry.
You're going to get in big trouble.
I was trying to hold myself.
I know.
You get excommunicated saying that.
No, because the thing is that it's amazing, because the Jewish soul, when it doesn't want to understand a word of Chassidus, it just says God can do anything. It's too holy. It's too holy to learn anything about godliness. I'm not being facetious, by the way. It's true. It's true. It says it revolts at the idea that anything could be true about godliness, because it senses the great transcendence of godliness. Maybe, at least that's the positive way. That's the positive way of looking at it.
It's not limited to the Hasidic world either, though.
Sorry?
The person that's not observant says, "Well, God knows I'm a good person because God does everything." That's it.
I see a connection for sure. Right? In all the Maimarim it says Halu as Hashem kol goyim, right? It's how do you get idols? How do you get idol worship? Because all the nations praise God, and the Maimarim say they're Reimamu Hashem kol goyim, right? Reimamu, right? They exalt God so much, He's so far away that you can do anything down here. This place is God's so great He has nothing to do with this place, right? Anyway, that's a whole discussion for a different time. Where were we? Ein Sof is everywhere by definition, right? We understand this concept because anything that is either revealing Him or it's concealing Him. Those are the two options, and both ways it's 100% Ein Sof. This is what we discussed earlier in our discourse. This idea is now coming back into our Maimer. And why is it coming back into our Maimer? We explained before that godliness is found below, literally as it's found above, right? Which is a different way of saying what we just said. What's the difference between below and above? The only difference is extent of divine self-concealment. That's the difference between below and above. So why would God be found below any less than above? Below is as godly a concept as above. There's no one is not more godly, one is not less godly. He's the Ein Sof, for goodness sake, right? Ukamasha Kasuv, and we have a pasuk just in case you don't believe it. And so Shemayim v'Haaretz ani maleh, the heavens and the earth I fill. Right? God is above, God is below, God is everywhere. Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. V'leis asar panim minei, there is no place that is devoid of Him. Right? We're saying this about the Ein Sof. Now the truth is we could overcomplicate this and go back to our whole discussion of Tzimtzum Loike Pshutai, of the non-literal Tzimtzum, and get into a whole bunch of other stuff right now, but I feel that would be overcomplicating things. So, we could be more precise in what we're saying. I'm just going to make a note. We're being specifically a little more general, not too bad, I hope. We're just going to say the Ein Sof is everywhere. There's more we could say, but that's what we're going to say here. The Ein Sof, the infinite presence of God, is everywhere. As discussed earlier in the Maimer, Leis asar panim minei, there is no place empty of Him. Rakshu helem legabenu, it's only that from our perspective, He is concealed. And we spent a lot of time earlier in the Maimer also discussing what is the divine concealment? The divine concealment is God making room for the recipient of the divine revelation, right? Just like when you speak to someone, speech is concealment because it allows the other person to understand what you're saying, right? So too, the divine self-concealment allows other realities, other levels of reality to arrive, as we discussed earlier in the discourse. And He does not shine in a revealed way here. If He shone in a revealed way, everywhere, everything would become absolutely nothing. In the sense that there would be no spiritual room, there would be no existential room for anything else to exist. It's 100% divine revelation all the time. And as we explained earlier in our Maimer, what's the source of anything else being able to exist? Divine self-concealment. So if there was pure divine self-revelation, nothing would exist but God. God wants other things to exist, so He makes divine concealment, which allows other things to exist. But in a concealed way, He is found here in this world just as He is found above. Literally, the Ein Sof and Olam Hazeh Gashmi, this physical universe, and Ein Sof have equal amounts of Ein Sof in them. In other words, when we say this physical universe, it's not in contradiction to Ein Sof, right? This physical universe is within Ein Sof. You've known Ein Sof your whole life. You've lived in Ein Sof. You just don't know it. It's Helem. It's the Ein Sof's infinite capacity for self-concealment. But it is nevertheless 100% Ein Sof all the time. V'ziv ha'ara mimenu, but it is a ray and a glimmer from that infinite being, nimshach b'chol nivra, that is drawn into every creation, l'hachayoso, to give it life, kana, as we explained before, right? You have the Ein Sof, you have the infinite presence of God. How is everything created, right? Going back to the first part of the Mimer, how is everything created? God says, let there be light, right? And there is light. In other words, God conceals himself in a way that allows the light to be expressed, as we explained earlier in our Mimer, right? These letters, Yehi are the divine self-concealment. That's why it's called speech, right? Because speech is the act of conveying to the other, which is a form of concealment. And the content of the speech gives the thing its nature. He says, let there be light, and that those words are what becomes the light, right? So in other words, God makes an expression, what we're calling here, a ziv v'ha'ara, a ray of that infinite being of God, a glimmer, a tiny expression, a very contracted and limited, almost entirely concealed manifestation of godliness is what goes into each creation to vivify it, to give it life, to give it its nature, right? God speaks to each thing from the inside and makes it be, right? That's the real message of God's speech. The teichen of God's speech is be, exist. God speaking to it makes it exist. Yes? But what this means, if you take it to its logical conclusion, if you think about it, is that in each and every place, literally, where the divine self-revelation has been extended to create a creation from the inside, to give, to vitalize, to give inner life to a creation, which means to give it a soul and make it be. In that very place exists Or Ein Sof itself, literally, right? Why? Because by definition, Or Ein Sof is literally everywhere. Nowhere can be empty of Or Ein Sof. All God has to hide himself with is himself, right? So when God is speaking to the other, right, speech goes out, right? Thought is self-expression. Action is expression with the language of the other, that the other already exists. Speech is it goes out from me to someone else, right? And that's the metaphor we used for the divine creation, right? But the truth is that everything that God is speaking to can be nothing else other than within the Or Ein Sof, because there is nowhere else, right? Where else would he speak these words? There is no space outside of the Ein Sof. There cannot be any space outside of the Ein Sof. All spaces are just various self-concealments and self-revelations of the Ein Sof. There is nowhere else, so to speak. When we say space, of course, we don't mean physically. We mean conceptually, spiritually. There is no mode, there is no reality, there is no dimension in which God manifests and makes exist anything that is outside of the Ein Sof. It's just a question of how concealed that revelation is. But where is it taking place, so to speak? What space, what dimension, what reality is this in? It's all within the Ein Sof. In other words, it's all just different configurations of the Ein Sof. The Ein Sof is the Ein Sof. It's just a question in every instance of how he's hiding his own face, right? He's here. It's just different ways of concealing himself. This is all what we said earlier. We're just saying it in a different way now. This is the same as what we said earlier. Everywhere he's manifested is just different ways of him revealing and concealing. It's different mixes and different combinations of self-revelation and self-concealment of the Ein Sof. Right? Now, that explanation that we gave at the beginning of the Maimer ended with the question, but what about the creation, right? I understand that about the divine self-revelation, self-concealment, that when God speaks, it's all within the Ein Sof, and everything is just the Ein Sof, nothing else is ever apart from it, and the Ein Sof is everywhere. And that's why Ani Havaya Le'Shanisi, even when God is saying, let there be light here, and he's saying, let there be firmament there, here and there are where? Here and there are within the Ein Sof. Every here and every there, by definition, is within the infinite infinitude of God. Yeah? So therefore, what about so that's all divine self-revelation, self-concealment, expression, the divine speech. Then we said, well, what about the creation? Because the creation is not just divine speech. It seems to be the result of the divine speech. It seems to be something actually comes into existence apart from Hashem. Right? Now we went into that and we worked back. We started from the creation and we said, well, you have to understand that this creation is not created through a process. It's created yesh ma'ayin. It's created something from nothing. When God says, let there be light, it's not like you think, which is that it's a process with God on one end and the creation on the other. There's a gap called a yesh ma'ayin gap. In that process, there's a something from nothing gap where one step cannot cause the next. The next step is not caused by the previous step. God intervenes to make this thing exist from outside of this process. Something from nothing. Yesh ma'ayin, right? He makes the rock to fly. There's a point where there's a rock that needs to fly, but the rock by definition cannot fly, doesn't have that potential. God has to mix in, he has to get involved, and he has to make that nothing be something. And that's how God makes light and everything else. And what that means, as we just finished explaining in our review, what that means is that even now this thing is batel b'metzias. Even now, all that's really here, all that was ever here, is the power that makes the rock fly, because rocks can't fly, right? All that's here is a rock that's being made to fly by God, right? Now what the Rebbe Rashab does is he puts these two ideas together. Right? The idea the idea from the beginning of the Maimer, which is that the Ein Sof is everywhere and nothing is outside of the reality of the Ein Sof, and even when God is concealing himself to an infinite extent to create a finite thing, that's also within the Ein Sof, right? We are now combining that with the idea that what are the creations? The creations are batel b'metzias. The creations are nothing but God intervening to make the rock fly. Right? How do we connect these two ideas? Let's see as follows. Shehu, almost halfway down the page. Shehu makar ha'er v'haziv. He says, you have to understand that the source of the divine self-concealment that is creating the world is the Ein Sof itself. The imkain, if so, mukhrach leimar, we are compelled to say, we have to say, shakol nivra batel b'tachlis be'ein sof atzmus u'mehusa. Every creation is nullified absolutely within Ein Sof itself. The kamei, what's a metaphor for this? Everything is nullified within the Ein Sof. Kamei, like ziv hashemesh, like a ray of the sun, shemeir la'aretz v'lodarea, that shines to the earth and those who dwell upon the earth. Kamei shehu beguf kader hashemesh, when it's found in the actual orb, the ball of the sun itself, sham batel b'tachlis, there it is absolutely nullified. Ve'enei oile b'shem ziv klal, you cannot even call it a ray. Ve'enei shayach leimar alav shu metzias b'fnei atzma, you can't even say that it exists as its own thing. Okay. Ela mekere batel b'tachlis ve'en b'metzias klal. Rather, all that's here is its source. It's absolutely nullified and it doesn't exist at all. Let's explain the metaphor first. You have the sun. The sun gives forth rays of light. Like I said, second and third chapter of Shar Yichud V'Amuna. That may have been before you got here.
You said it. My question is, the Chassidim at the time, he's repeating virtually everything that the author said.
Yes.
But why? Where were his Chassidim that he had to give a mimer that is regurgitating?
No. They knew already.
So why?
Because first of all, there's new explanations that are not found in Tanya.
Okay.
And second of all, the mimer doesn't exist to give new information usually. That's not why the mimer is said in the first place. That's a different discussion of why say a mimer. What's the point of a mimer? God willing. So, you have the ray of the sun in the sun. The ray of the sun comes out from the sun to illuminate the earth. You have the source of the expression, and you have the expression itself, which is the ray. The expression comes only from this source. It comes only from the sun. Where does the sun's ray come from? It comes from the sun, and nowhere else. Nothing else creates the ray of the sun. Now, those who have been paying attention to previous classes realize that this itself means it's a metaphor for Yesh Ma'ayin. The fact that it has only one source, that's a different way of saying, counterintuitively, I can't remember when we discussed this last time or the time before. Counterintuitively, this is a way of saying it is created Yesh Ma'ayin. It is created something from nothing, right? Not really, not literally the ray of the sun from the sun, not literally in the way it actually works, metaphorically, right? You say that the sun is the single source for the ray. If you want to get more technical, you'll see that it doesn't really work. Nothing physical can really be the single source for something, as we discussed when we discussed this concept. But metaphorically, the sun is the only source for the ray, which is a different way of saying it's like Yesh Ma'ayin. What does it mean, Yesh Ma'ayin? It means that this thing was not a potential being actualized, because every time a potential is actualized, it's two things interacting, right? Rather, it is one thing expressing. Just like God makes something exist by fiat, right? God says the thing should exist, and He makes it exist. Yesh Ma'ayin, something from nothing, right? That's what it means to truly have one source, one thing that you come from. This idea is familiar. I've spoken about this in previous classes, yes. So in the metaphor, the ray of the sun has only one source, which is the orb, the ball of the sun, right? Which means only if a thing has one source can you really say the following, by the way. If it has multiple sources, you'll see why it doesn't work instantly, right? If a thing has one singular source, it has to be found in the source just like it's found outside the source, right? Why? Because if not, where does the thing come from, right? Now, if you go back to an example of two things coming together to create, like for example, the potter who takes the clay and makes it into the shape of a pot, you'll see instantly why this doesn't work, right? The pot does not exist in its source. It doesn't exist in the clay because the clay doesn't have this shape, and it doesn't exist in the potter because the potter can't hold soup. Yeah, you need both of them to come together. That's how things work in this world. In our reality, in the logical reality, right? Things are, when a potential is actualized, it means that something has come along and actualized it. So there's always two parties. There's always two things involved. There's a potential, and then there's something that comes along and brings that potential to actuality. And if you zoom in very closely, you'll see that in all physical reactions, even the sun actually producing light, in the physical light, this is also true, right? Because as we know, when the sun produces light, it's an interaction in the sun. It's not the sun is not one thing. The sun is many things, right?
Like the fire and the Flintstone.
Like the fire and the Flintstone.
In the Flintstone.
No, that's Ronnie, you're getting that's way too ahead for me. I can't. It's too much. I'm speaking the physical sun. The physical sun has interactions within it, right? There's a nuclear reaction. There's things inside the sun moves, right? Sometimes it makes more light. Sometimes it makes less light. You can't say the sun is the source of the light, because if you realize that the sun is not one thing, right? And the truth is for all human action as well, because we do things that seem to be us causing ourselves to change all the time, right? Every time you move, it's yourself causing yourself to change. But all bodily change is not one thing, right? When I move my arm, there's one ligament which is pulling on a different ligament, which is fired by this neuron, which is moved by this thing, right? And in fact, if you trace it all the way back, as we did when we were talking about our melting ice cream, you'll eventually find God is actually involved in this whole chain, even when you move your pinky finger, right? But so in our reality, it doesn't exist, that there's only one cause for something. This is metaphorical, right? Say the sun is the source of the ray, the sole source of the ray. That means that the thing that is produced has to exist entirely within its source, right? The pot that the potter makes doesn't exist entirely in either of its sources because it's a collaboration. It's two things coming together and each contributes an aspect. But if there is no collaboration, if one thing truly is doing this itself, if something truly is just making this thing exist, which isn't really logical, all by itself, then that thing must be found in its original source. So the ray of the sun, which shines from the sun, must exist within the sun, right? Now the thing is that the ray of this, when something is created yesh ma'ayin, what does that mean? It means the thing that is created has no existence in its source. So it almost seems like a contradiction, right? Because if it existed in potential in its source, that would be yesh mi-yesh. That's the definition of something from something. It existed in potential, like the pot existed in potential in the clay, and then that potential was brought up. So when we say that the ray of the sun is in the sun, metaphorically again, we're not saying it exists in potential in the sun. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying it exists in potential there. That's not what it's a metaphor for. We are saying it has to exist literally there. The ray of the sun has to literally be in the sun, right? Now the thing is that it can't be in the sun because the sun is the sun, not a ray, right? Just like when we say God is literally making this table come into existence from nothing, you can't say the table exists in God as a table. Right? In fact, if the table existed in God as a table, number one, he wouldn't be God. And number two, it wouldn't be created yesh ma'ayin. It would just be moved from one place to another. Right? Do you see the paradox here? On the one hand, if you create something from nothing, it has to be found in its source. On the other hand, the very definition of what something from nothing means is that this thing doesn't exist in its source at all. It's new. It's 100% completely new. It's being made to exist. Right? It's like saying a flying rock exists in the arm. A flying rock doesn't exist in the arm. Right? How does it exist in its source? Right? It exists in its source in a state of absolute bittul. What do we mean by absolute bittul? We mean you can't even call it something other than the source. Right? Because if you think about it, the ray of the sun in the sun is not a ray, it's sun. It has to be there. Logically, it has to be there, but you can't separate the way it is there from the sun being there, because there is no ray in the sun, there's only sun.
It doesn't exist as a separate
thing from the sun. Correct, exactly right.
Until it's emitted.
So it has to be there, but on the other hand, it can't be there. So what?
It's not a ray.
That's exactly what I'm saying. But it has to be in the sun because that's its only source, right? If it's not in the sun, then it's nowhere, right? It has to be in the sun. In fact, it says in Tanya, it has to be in the sun more than it has to be on the earth because it's closer to its source, right? Metaphorically, right? It exists more in the sun than it exists out of the sun, right? So, the ray of the sun in the sun means, on the one hand, if you're creating something from nothing, then that something comes only from one place. So it has to be found. It has to originally be within the thing that is creating it. But on the other hand, it cannot be within the thing that creates it. So how is it there? It's there in a way where there is only the thing that creates it. Not the thing itself, and not even the potential for the thing itself. Because something from nothing, there's no potential. There's no potential for a ray in the sun in the metaphor. In the metaphor, there's no potential of the ray in the sun. You trace the ray back. If the ray has left the sun 1 inch, that means it must be within the sun, if the sun is its only source, right? So when you go back and you say the ray is in the sun, the ray of the sun is in the sun, what that means is that really all that's here is the sun. The ray is here, but how is the ray here? Sun is here. That is the way that the ray is in the sun, is by the sun being here. right? It's not Eile b'shem ziv bifnei atzmei, right? You can't call it by the name Ray, because there's nothing to distinguish it from the sun in the metaphor. There's only sun here, there's no Ray here. Even though I know the Ray is here also, because this is its only source, right? So too, when God speaks and conceals himself to create something, where is he creating it? Now, it looks to us like he creates it outside of himself, because we have fleshly eyes, and also there's a tzimtzum as it goes on to explain in Tanya in chapter 4, in chapter 5, in chapter 6, and it goes on and explains the tzimtzum in Shem Elokim, and God's concealing himself. That's why I said it's all out of order, because we've explained this already in our mimer. In our mimer it comes first, and this comes second, right? Ultimately, none of that self-concealment means anything other than an extension of Ein Sof. It's weiter Göttlichkeit. Where is this whole thing being, when God creates this table, something from nothing, where is it created? It's created in the only source of the thing, which is Ein Sof, right? Which means the thing exists within its makar, the thing exists within its source and never departed its source. Which means, not only is there a table that's batul b'metzias, that is nothing but a manifestation of godliness. Not only is it true that there is no such thing as a flying rock, there's only a rock that's been made to fly, which is what we said before. Ultimately, there's nothing here but the arm. There is no rock, right? The only thing that exists here is the source of the manifestation, like the ray of the sun and the sun, because in the real life, in the metaphor, the ray can leave the sun, right? With the Ein Sof, it's like the sun is everywhere. All that exists is the sun. There is nowhere that's outside of the sun. You say, God conceals himself to make a mata, to make a lower place which is outside of the sun. We spend a whole page at the beginning of the mimer and multiple classes explaining that's not really outside the sun. That's within the sun. That's weiter sun. That's further sun. There's nothing here but the Ein Sof. This place is filled with nothing but the Ein Sof. The sun is everywhere. The ray never leaves the sun. And if so, what does that mean? It means that this table is not just the ray. This table is actually the sun, right? There is no godliness manifesting as the table, right? Just like there is no sun manifesting as a ray within the sun. There's just the sun. What does it mean for the ray to be here? It means that the sun is here. That's the way the ray exists in the sun. Similarly, what does it mean for this table to be here? It means the divine source of the table is here. And that's all it means. It's not Eile b'shem ziv klal. You can't even call it a creation. You can't even call it something that's separate from its source in the divine. All that's here is the source. The source is all that's here. The manifestation is not a manifestation at all because it's within its own source. And even more batul than a rock not being able to fly, a rock being made to fly, right? That is separate from its source. The arm is the source. The rock being made to fly is in a separate place. Because God uniquely is truly infinite and is truly Ein Sof, when God makes something exist, when he makes the nothing into something, where is he doing that? Within its own source. And within its own single source, all that's here is the makar, there's no ziv. All that's here is the sun, there's no ray. And therefore, not only is the table not a rock that flies on itself, not only is the nothing not something, the nothing is nothing but the godliness that comes to impose on it. Right? It's not even a flying rock. It's the power, it's as if the rock is within the arm, which is why, again, it doesn't make sense, right? The ray of the sun is in the sun, right? All that's here is the makar. All that's here is the Ein Sof, right? That is the extent to which the nivra is batul, which we can only explain using the first half of the mimer. Again, right? This is the Rebbe Rashab bringing it all together. With the first half of our explanation of God not changing is that everything is Ein Sof is everywhere by definition. Now we're saying that once you understand that, you understand the deeper level of bittul, a deeper understanding of the bittul of the nivra, the bittul of the creation. The creation is nullified to the extent that all that's here is its source, like the ray of the sun in the sun. Let's read it inside.
Which inevitably take us to the question.
1 minute fast.
Okay.
Is there life before death?
What?
Which inevitably brings the question, Is there life before death?
What does that mean?
Is there life?
Nothing exists.
What would you say? Is there life before death?
Is there life before death?
I'm not sure what that means. It's very profound.
All right.
What does it mean?
It means nothing exists, actually.
Other than God.
No, it doesn't mean nothing exists. It means what is its existence? Its existence is its source. Its existence is Göttlichkeit. The existence of the thing is nothing but godliness.
All right. Same thing.
That means it doesn't exist. Okay. If that's what you mean by not existing, then fine. We're on the same page.
Everything exists as long as Hashem keeps creating it.
We're on the same. We're on the same page.
All right, all right.
You got 1 minute
Hmm.
before the crowd start funneling in, the masses. You said 8:20 is what time you called.
Rak shemer, v'rak, end of the line, halfway down the page. Rak shemer l'mata shaykh alav kriya shem ziv. It is only when the ray of the sun shines beyond the sun that you could call it by the name of a ray, b'fnei atzmai on its own, b'bnei shelo yesh kan guf kadar hashemesh, because the actual orb of the sun does not exist here. Makere, which is its source. But as the thing is in its source, it is totally nullified in its existence. To the extent that you can't even say that call it a ray, right? So too, in what we're trying to explain, in godliness and the creation, since the infinite God himself is found below like he is found above, in each and every place, literally, there is no place devoid of him at all. If so, the ray of the divine light which shines and extends into each creation is absolutely nullified to the Ein Sof itself, just like the ray of the sun renders within the body of the sun itself, where it has no existence whatsoever. It's only when it's below that you can call it a ziv b'fnei atzmai on its own terms, because here it is distant from its source. If so, Ein Sof itself, it is found in each and every place, literally, where the ray extends itself, there Ein Sof is found. If so, the ray is constantly within its own source. Every place that it is, its sources. That's where Ein Sof is. It's absolutely nullified. Until can't be called a ray at all. We're almost done with our chapter. We'll stop it here. I do want to say, Ronnie,